and almost nobody can answer it.
What is a woman?
What is a woman?
Marry one and find out.
One of the things I tell young people all the time, I'm not a very typical psychologist in this regard, because psychologists like to pat people on the head and say, you're all right the way you are. I talked to Bishop Barron a while ago. I'm going to broadcast this, and he said that the Catholic priests were trained in the 1960s to kind of be accepting, humanistically. Mm-hmm. You're okay the way you are, And that's such rubbish.
I should at least know exactly what I did wrong if I am required to acknowledge that my tweet violated the Twitter rules. What rules, you sons of bitches? Exactly.
Most young women are taught badly that the most important thing that they'll do in their life is their career, and that's simply not true.
Do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition, and I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense, because what do you mean by real? The Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this, and that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. Like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on. And that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me.
The things I tell young men, well, and young women as well, but the young men really need to hear this more, I think, is that you should be a monster. Because everyone says, well, you should be harmless, virtuous. You shouldn't do anyone any harm. You should sheath your competitive instinct. You shouldn't try to win. You don't want to be too aggressive. You don't want to be too assertive. You want to take a back seat and all of that. It's like, no. Wrong. You should be a monster. An absolute monster, and then you should learn how to control it.
It's very narcissistic.
Well, there's also this idea that's promoted by the people who are protecting those who are easily offended, that the way to make people secure is to protect them from things that they don't want to encounter. And there isn't a clinician, like I'm a trained clinical psychologist, and there isn't a clinician in the country who's worth his or her salt that would ever make that claim. Because you don't make people... First of all, it's hard to make people safe because life is seriously not safe.
Yes.
And the way that you make people resilient is by exposing them to things that they're afraid of and that make them uncomfortable voluntarily. But you use exposure.
Right.
And so, like, if you over coddle people, if you protect them from everything that's sharp, you make them dull and stupid and narcissistic, and it's a really bad idea.
So you do know America.
It's your free speech. Can one not also argue, based on your interpretation, that professors can use racial slurs in their classroom, and that the inability to do so would violate their freedom of speech?
There's a difference between saying that there's something you can't say and saying that there are things that you have to say. And I regard these made-up pronouns, all of them, as the neologisms of radical PC authoritarians.
Do you understand that? And I'm not a fan of that sort of person. And the reason I'm not a fan of that sort of person is because I've done my homework. I've read everything I can get my hands on in the development of authoritarian political systems, and I know the literature inside out and backwards. And I am not going to be a mouthpiece for language that I detest. And that's that.
Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
A certain amount of persistence is called for. If you're mobbed on social media, a brief bit of advice by people who are doing exactly the sort of thing that you're describing, I would say two things. The first is be careful about what you've said and what you've said in the past, and maybe it's a bit too late for that. The second thing I would say is, if you haven't done anything wrong, do not apologize.
That is your...
Fans, that the ones that we talk to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines, in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death.
In what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
A very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely?
Appointed 50% of females to 50% of his cabinet because it was, what did he say? Well, because it's 2015. It's like, no, quarter of your elected members of parliament were female. If your job was to pick the most qualified people, period, regardless of their genitalia, because they're leading the country. You pick the most qualified people. Instead, he abdicated his responsibility to make those difficult decisions and then wallpapered it over with this casual virtue of, well, I'm going to promote women. It's like, what if I'm speaking to 10 people? Do I get to offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? You're going to come out on stage and you're going to say something important about something vital, and you're not going to offend 1 person in 1,000? Well, you can't say anything about anything important ever without offending probably the person you're talking to. Important speech about important issues, especially contentious issues, is instantly offensive.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all. But so, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable.
We are both privileged white males. Can we really understand the suffering of women?
Well, it depends on how useful your capacity for understanding the suffering of others is, or how well developed that is.
I don't see that it's necessarily any more difficult to understand the suffering of women. Well, I would never pose the question that way because I don't know how you understand the suffering of a group being an individual. I don't think a woman can understand the suffering of women because that's predicated on the assumption that an individual can take on the burden of a group, and I don't buy that assumption to begin with. I think we vary in the ability to, let's say, empathize with others, but I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that you can't empathize across a gender barrier, otherwise no relationship would even be possible.
Let's get precise.
To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's like specialized for me so that I can account for my damn privilege, so that I can stop hearing about it?
One of the things I tell young people all the time, I'm not a very typical psychologist in this regard because psychologists like to pat people on the head and say, you're all right the way you are. I talked to Bishop Barron a while ago. I'm going to broadcast this, and he said that the Catholic priests were trained in the 1960s to kind of be accepting, humanistically. You're okay the way you are, And that's such rubbish. It's like, not only are you not okay the way you are, you don't think that anybody else is okay the way they are either. And you don't think your children are okay the way they are, like you love them and all that, but you don't want them to stay 3 years old their entire life. You want them to expand and improve and become who they are. And so, instead of telling young people that they're okay the way they are, I tell them that, and it's a terrible message for them if they're desperate. So let's say 10% of the people in my audience are young, maybe they're young men, just for the sake of argument, and they're like not in good shape. They don't have any goals. They're drinking too much. They're watching pornography all the time. They've got no aim. They've got no structure in their life, and they're just bloody miserable. And the misery is twisting them into malevolence, because enough misery will absolutely do that to you. And then what are you going to do? And come along and say, well, you're okay the way you are? It's like, that's the last thing they want to hear. It's like, get your damn act together. You got things to do, and they're going to be difficult.
What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. Often young people are afraid of commitment because they feel that that's going to interfere with their pursuit of something more valuable, but that's just not the case. You're not going to find something more valuable in your life than a committed relationship with someone that you love, that sustains itself across time, and that in all likelihood produces children. That's life. There may be people for whom avoiding that is the better route, but those people are very rare, and you need a real reason to assume that you're one of those people.
What is it that you think that people are hungry for? They want to hear from you.
They're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges and freedom and impulsive pleasure, and those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good.
I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Well, so the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male, and we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours, they work more dangerous jobs, they're more likely to move, they're more likely to work outside, they're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable, they make more money for those reasons, and that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis.
There's no such thing as a gender-affirming therapist. That's a contradiction in terms.
Why?
Because you don't affirm if you're a therapist. It's not your business to affirm. You come to see me because there's something wrong. Maybe you come to see me because a destructive element of you is wreaking havoc in your life. I'm on the side of the part of you that wants to aim up, man. That's what I'm on the side of. Okay, now I don't know what that means in your case, but we're going to talk about it. Am I going to affirm what you think? No, it's not up to me to affirm it. You don't get a casual pat on the back from a therapist for your pre-existing axiomatic conclusions. That's not therapy. That's a rubber stamp. You step wrong as a therapist, you say the wrong thing once and like your bloody career is over. And now it's the same with physicians. How's that going to work? You're going to go have an honest conversation with your physician when he's terrified out of his mind that he'll say something politically incorrect during the diagnostic process? Hey man, you're sick with whatever you want to be. See you later. You want a prescription for something?
Does this really matter is another question. So,
matters for those who are getting double mastectomies when they're 16.
Why should we care if we live in a society where gender is fluid?
Well, I cared because my government decided that I had to call people by the terms that they designated, or I'd be subject to legal penalties. It's like, no, I'm not doing that. I don't care what your reason is. You don't get control of my tongue.
Experiments legal? Yes, under the laws of the time. But were they criminal? I'll leave that question up to you to answer. And further, perhaps it might be objected, what about the damage done by hypothetically leaving those confused about their identity to dwell in their confusion? Aren't we morally obliged to intervene? And I would say, no. Why? Well, first, do no harm, as the Hippocratic Oath, remember that, insists. And second, it has been a matter of historical consensus that sins of omission are less egregious than sins of commission. Thus, leaving someone with gender dysphoria, no matter how warranted, and perhaps it is in a very tiny minority of truly unfortunate cases, to suffer the consequences of the theoretical mismatch between soul and body is less of a risk ethically, personally, socially, and philosophically than the extremely active intervention that constitutes so-called gender-confirming, another hated phrase, surgery. I might also point out that the trans surgery enterprise is now a $300 million per annum growth industry. Rate of projected expansion, 15% per year. Projected increase by 2027 to $750 million per year. An expanding enterprise in a time of global uncertainty. Time to invest, both in the requisite surgical skills and perhaps in any industry associated with this vicious and unconscionable fad, primarily entangling, as such things so often do, the youthful and female. Isn't that a concern, intersectionalists? Not when push comes to shove or ideology to scalpel. Is that not a true moral hazard? And I'm not taking down that tweet or acknowledging that my tweet violated the Twitter rules. Up yours, woke moralists. There are no risk-free paths forward. There's only one risk or another. Pick your poison. That's the choice life offers. I am weary of living under the increasingly authoritarian dictates of a polity hyper-concerned with one risk and oblivious to all others. And things are shaking around us.